She was a veteran mom looking for a quiet life, but the deserted military base she bought held a secret worth millions. What she found inside would not only change her life but would challenge the very government she once served. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story opens with Rachel Brooks, a former staff sergeant, using a heavy-duty angle grinder to cut the final weld on the massive steel door of a Cold War-era military outpost she has just purchased. Sparks flew in the dim light of the cavernous entrance, a shower of incandescent gold against the oppressive gray of the concrete. The high-pitched scream of the grinder was the first real noise the valley had heard from this place in decades, a violent awakening for a sleeping giant. They called it the Sentinel, she thought, her voice a low murmur inside her head, lost beneath the tool's shriek. A concrete ghost watching over a valley that time forgot. Now it's mine. The final thread of tortured metal gave way with a reluctant snap, and the grinder whined down into silence. The quiet that rushed back in was heavier, more profound than before. It was the quiet of a tomb. But the scene shifts, jumping forward in time to a moment of unbearable tension. Deep within the mountain's heart, far from the initial entrance, Rachel stands before a second, hidden vault door. This one is smaller, more sinister in its secrecy. Her hand, trembling almost imperceptibly, rests on the cold steel handle of a manual hydraulic jack she has painstakingly rigged to the ancient locking mechanism. The air is thick with the smell of dust and ozone. With a grunt of effort, she pumps the jack's handle. A low groan echoes from within the lock's tumblers, a sound like a forgotten secret being forced from its iron throat. The pressure builds, the metal of the door frame creaking in protest. Her heart hammers against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence. The tumblers, frozen for half a century, begin to grind, to shift. The sound is agonizingly slow, a drawn-out screech of metal on metal that seems to echo through the very rock around her. Just as the heavy door begins to move, a hairline crack of absolute darkness appearing at its edge, the scene cuts, leaving the resolution hanging in the balance. With the main entrance finally breached, Rachel, along with her curious 10-year-old son, Leo, began their first exploration of the main levels of the outpost. Their flashlights, powerful beams of clean white light, sliced through the gloom, revealing a world frozen in time. They walked through dusty corridors, their footsteps the only sound, echoing off the cold, unyielding walls. The air was a thick cocktail of smells, a layered history of the place. The dominant note was dust, fine and gray, coating every surface like a layer of volcanic ash. Beneath that was the sharp, mineral scent of stale concrete, and deeper still, the faint, ghostly perfume of diesel from the generator room, a phantom of power long since silenced. Sunlight, weak and watery, struggled to pierce the grimy, wire-meshed windows, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe at the edges of their flashlight beams. The silence was a physical presence, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gritty floor and the rhythmic, maddening drip, drip, drip of water from some unseen leak deep within the mountain's guts. They found the mess hall first. Salt and pepper shakers still stood sentinel on the long metal tables, their contents caked into solid blocks. In the barracks, rows of metal-framed bunks stood in silent formation, their thin mattresses stripped bare, waiting for soldiers who would never return. The command center was the most haunting of all. It was a cathedral of obsolete technology, filled with hulking consoles of silent, dark equipment. Reels of magnetic tape sat in their racks, and thick bundles of cables snaked across the floor like dead serpents. Leo, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and a little fear, spun in a slow circle. "Mom, did soldiers really live here?" he whispered, his voice seeming loud in the stillness. "It's like a movie set." Rachel reached out and ran a hand over the cool, smooth surface of a communications console. "They did, buddy. A long time ago." She moved towards a massive map of the world that covered one entire wall, its surface yellowed and brittle with age. Thin red lines, representing Soviet missile trajectories, arced across continents and oceans. They were watching for threats, making sure we were all safe. A wave of something complex and bittersweet washed over her, a familiar ache of nostalgia mixed with the heavy weight of duty. She remembered her time as a signals tech in Afghanistan, the constant, low-level hum of the radios that became the soundtrack to her life. She could almost feel the grit of sand between her teeth, taste the metallic tang of lukewarm water from her canteen. She remembered the immense, crushing weight of responsibility, knowing that a missed or misinterpreted signal could have catastrophic consequences. This place, this concrete shell, felt like a different kind of battlefield, one she had chosen for herself, a war against decay and forgetting. Their exploration eventually led them to the armory. The thick steel door was not just locked. It was sealed in a way that sent a prickle of unease up Rachel's spine. It had been crudely welded shut at the seams. Thick, sloppy beads of molten metal ran along the entire perimeter of the door, fusing it to the frame. It was an ugly, brutal act of sealing. "Why would they weld it shut, Mom?" Leo asked, his small hand tracing the rough, lumpy texture of the weld. "What's inside?" Rachel knelt, her own fingers probing the metal. "Standard procedure for decommissioning, Leo," she explained, her voice even, betraying none of her internal turmoil. "They clear everything out, weapons, ammunition, everything. Then they seal it up so no one can get in." She gave him a wry smile, trying to keep the mood light. "Or so nothing can get out." The joke fell flat, even to her own ears. A seed of suspicion, small and hard, had been planted. Her training, the ingrained discipline of a non-commissioned officer, took over. She looked at the welds again, not as a civilian property owner, but as a technician. They were messy, unprofessional. The beads were uneven, pitted with air bubbles, and showed signs of overheating. This wasn't the work of a disciplined Army Corps of Engineers team. This looked like a rush job, done by someone who was strong but unskilled, someone who cared more about speed than precision. It was an anomaly, a detail that didn't fit the official narrative of a careful, by-the-book decommissioning. Her gaze dropped to the floor. The concrete was thick with dust, but even in the dim light, she could see them. Faint scuff marks, long parallel lines, leading away from the armory door and disappearing down the corridor towards the generator room. It was exactly the kind of sign left by something heavy, something awkward, being dragged across the floor. Her mind started working, connecting the dots. The sloppy weld, the scuff marks. It didn't feel like procedure. It felt like a cover-up. The anomaly of the welded door was a hook that had sunk deep into Rachel's analytical mind. It was a puzzle, and she had always been drawn to puzzles. She decided to conduct a full technical survey of the entire outpost, to map its bones and nervous system. She retrieved her old field toolkit from her truck, the familiar weight of it in her hand a comfort. The tools were worn, the handles smooth from years of use, each scratch and dent a memory. She also unrolled the set of original blueprints she had acquired with the property, the paper old and brittle, smelling faintly of vanilla and thyme. She handled them with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. With Leo helping by holding the flashlight beam steady, a job he took with the utmost seriousness, she began the methodical, patient work of a signals technician. This was her element. The quiet confidence, the sure hands, the focused mind. She started by tracing the electrical and communication conduit runs throughout the facility. Prying open junction boxes, she examined the thick, bundled cables. Their colored plastic sheaths faded, but still identifiable. She followed them through the walls, their paths hidden in the concrete guts of the mountain, using the blueprints as her guide but trusting her own eyes more. Leo, trailing behind her, was a constant stream of questions. "What's that wire for? Why are there so many? Is this like the internet?" Rachel answered him patiently, explaining the difference between power lines, data cables, and antenna feeds. "I'm looking for anomalies, buddy," she told him, her voice slightly muffled as she peered into a ceiling cavity. "Things that don't match the plans. In my job, you learn that the map is only a guide. The real territory always has surprises." Her search led them, inevitably, back to the generator room. The air here was thickest with the ghost of diesel, and the centerpiece of the room was a massive, silent diesel engine. a green-painted behemoth that could have powered a small town. It was behind this engine, in the darkest corner of the room, that she found it. According to the blueprints, a major conduit trunk, a bundle of cables as thick as her arm, should have terminated at a large junction box on the far wall. The blueprint was explicit, the symbol for the box clearly marked. But as she traced the conduit with her hand, following its cold, rigid path along the ceiling and down the wall, it didn't end at a box. It simply vanished. The thick metal pipe, carrying dozens of unseen wires, ran straight into the smooth, featureless surface of a cinder block wall. There was no box, no outlet, no access panel. Just a wall that, according to the official plans, shouldn't have been there. The conduit disappeared into the concrete as if it had been swallowed whole. Rachel stood back, the beam of her flashlight fixed on the spot. The map had lied. The real territory, as she had told her son, was full of surprises. And she had a strong feeling that this surprise was the beginning of the real story. The sloppy weld on the armory door was a question, but this was a clue. A solid, undeniable deviation from the official record, hidden in the one place no one would ever think to look. Rachel studied the cinder block wall, her flashlight beam tracing the mortar lines. It looked newer than the surrounding poured concrete, the gray of the blocks a slightly lighter shade, the texture rougher. The mortar lines were the real giveaway, though. They were too clean, too perfect. Military construction, especially from that era, was functional, strong, but rarely pristine. This looked like a contractor's job, not a soldier's. She tapped the center of the wall with the hard plastic handle of her screwdriver. Instead of the solid, dense thud of concrete backed by earth and rock, she heard a faint, hollow echo, a subtle resonance that vibrated back through the tool into her hand. It was the sound of empty space. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through her. It was the thrill of the hunt, the confirmation of a hunch that had been building since she first laid eyes on the sloppy welds of the armory door. She felt her senses sharpen, the world narrowing to this single point of focus, this wall that was not a wall. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered to herself, a slow grin spreading across her face. From the corridor behind her, Leo's voice was a small, curious echo. "What is it? Did you find something?" Rachel turned, her expression a mixture of excitement and stern maternal authority. "I think so. Stand back, Leo. Way back. Go stand by the main door to this room." He hesitated for a second, his eyes wide, then nodded and scurried away, his footsteps receding down the concrete hall. She waited until he was a safe distance away before turning back to the wall. She retrieved the small sledgehammer from her toolkit. It was heavy in her hand, the balance familiar and comforting. She planted her feet, took a deep, steadying breath, and swung. The hammer hit the wall with a deafening crack, the impact shuddering up her arms. A spiderweb of fractures instantly radiated from the point of impact, thin white lines against the gray block. She didn't pause. She swung again, putting her shoulders and back into it. This time, the blocks shattered, imploding inward with a cascade of crumbling mortar and broken concrete, revealing a dark, narrow opening behind them. A cloud of dust, thick with the dry scent of 50-year-old cement, billowed out into the generator room. The adrenaline surged, a feeling she hadn't felt in years, not since her last tour. It wasn't the adrenaline of fear, but of discovery. She felt intensely, wonderfully alive. The opening led to a low, cramped crawl space, barely 4 feet high. The air that drifted out was cold and dead, utterly devoid of the diesel phantom that haunted the generator room. Rachel strapped a headlamp on, the familiar elastic band tight against her forehead, and grabbed her toolkit. "Leo, I'm going in," she called out, her voice steady. "You wait right where you are. Do not come over here. Understand?" "I understand, Mom." His voice came back, small but clear. She took one last look at the bright, dusty space of the generator room and then squeezed through the jagged hole she had made. The transition was immediate and absolute. The air inside was frigid, and the silence was so complete it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. The space was filled with dust that seemed ancient, undisturbed for generations, and cobwebs hung in thick, ghostly curtains from the low ceiling. The floor was rough, unfinished concrete, scraping against the thick canvas of her work pants. It was a forgotten space, a void within the mountain, a secret buried within a secret. Her headlamp beam cut a sharp, brilliant cone through the oppressive darkness, illuminating a narrow tunnel that stretched forward into blackness. She began to crawl, her knees and elbows protesting against the rough surface. The toolkit, slung over her shoulder, bumped awkwardly against her side. Every few feet, she paused, sweeping the beam of her light from side to side, examining the raw concrete walls, the ceiling, the floor. There was nothing. No pipes, no wires, no markings. Just a tunnel leading deeper into the rock. After about 30 feet of slow, arduous crawling, her light fell on it. The tunnel ended abruptly, not in a rockfall or a dead end, but in a solid wall of dark, formidable steel. It was a second vault door. It was smaller than the main armory door, perhaps only 5 feet tall, but it looked just as formidable, if not more so. It was made of a single, thick plate of reinforced steel, set flush into a heavy frame that was bolted directly into the surrounding concrete. In the center was a complex-looking combination wheel, a heavy, spoked dial of machined brass, and below it, a thick, horizontal locking bar that looked capable of stopping a tank. This was no supply closet. This was a place designed to keep something in, or to keep the world out with absolute certainty. Rachel crawled closer, her heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She ran her gloved hand over the cold, smooth steel of the door. It was perfectly sealed, no gaps, no visible hinges. Her light traced the edges of the door, the combination dial, the locking bar. Then she saw it. Scratched crudely into the metal just to the right of the dial, almost obscured by a half-century of grime, was a series of alphanumeric characters. She rubbed away the dust with her thumb, her breath catching in her throat as the inscription became clear. Cut code 73B Echo. Her blood ran cold. She knew that format. It was a designation she had seen only a few times before, buried deep in declassified Cold War technical manuals she'd had to study during her advanced signals intelligence training. Cut codes were designations for emergency, off-the-books installations. They were ghost sites, caches and bunkers that were never meant to appear on any official blueprint or manifest. They were to be accessed only in the most dire of circumstances, the absolute last resort in a scenario like a full-scale Soviet invasion of North America. They were the final whisper of a government facing annihilation. This vault wasn't part of the official outpost. It was something else entirely, a secret hidden even from the soldiers who had lived and worked here, a contingency buried so deep it was practically a myth. The messy, unprofessional weld on the main armory door suddenly made perfect, chilling sense. It wasn't standard procedure. It was a diversion. Someone, probably one of the last people to know this vault existed, had wanted to ensure that the main, obvious vault was sealed in a way that looked final and absolute, drawing all attention to it, making any potential explorer think the story ended there. It was a crude but effective piece of misdirection, designed to protect this far more secret, far more important cache. The combination dial was a beautiful, useless piece of brass. The sequence would have been known only to a handful of people, all of whom were likely long dead. The knowledge turned to dust along with them. But Rachel was a technician, a problem solver. Her mind didn't see an impassable obstacle. It saw a mechanical system with tolerances and weaknesses. She shone her light on the locking mechanism, studying how the heavy steel bar was seated in its bracket on the frame. It was purely mechanical. There were no visible electronics, no wires running to it. It was a simple, brutal physical lock. If she could apply enough focused force, she reasoned, she might be able to manually retract the bolts, to break the mechanism rather than solve it. She crawled back out of the oppressive darkness of the tunnel, blinking as her eyes readjusted to the comparatively bright generator room. Leo was still standing exactly where she had told him to, a small, worried figure by the far door. "I need to get some more tools from the truck," she told him, her voice echoing in the large space. "I'll be right back. Don't move." She returned a few minutes later, dragging a heavy-duty manual hydraulic jack, the kind used for lifting trucks, and carrying a small stack of thick steel blocks she used for leveling equipment. The work was slow, difficult, and physically exhausting. The crawl space was too cramped to stand or even kneel properly, and she had to lie on her side, contorting her body to get the jack into position. Sweat dripped from her forehead, carving clean paths through the grime on her face. The only sounds in the suffocating silence were her own grunts of effort, the metallic scrape of the jack against the concrete floor, and the steady, rhythmic beat of her own heart. From the opening, Leo's voice was a thin thread of sound in the darkness. "Are you okay, Mom?" Rachel paused, resting her forehead against the cold steel of the vault door. She took a breath. "Just having a conversation with a stubborn door, buddy," she called back, her voice strained. "I'm winning." She finally managed to wedge the jack into place, its base braced against the opposite wall of the tunnel and its piston head pressed directly against the center of the locking bar. She took another deep breath and began to pump the handle. The jack's handle was short, allowing for only a small range of motion in the tight space. Each pump was a struggle, a full-body effort. The pressure began to build, the hydraulic fluid inside the jack groaning under the immense strain. The steel of the vault door, which had been silent for 50 years, began to sing a high, protesting note. The locking bar, a solid 2-inch thick piece of hardened steel, began to bow almost imperceptibly in the middle. She kept pumping, her muscles burning, her vision narrowing. The groaning of the metal grew louder, deeper, a sound of tortured steel being pushed beyond its limits. With one final, desperate heave on the handle, there was a sudden, explosive crack that was so loud it felt like a physical blow. The sound echoed back down the tunnel, a sharp, violent report that was followed by the screech of metal as the locking bar, its internal mechanism shattered, gave way, retracting a full 2 inches into the body of the door. She had broken it. The vault was open. With the locking bar broken, the wheel turned freely in her hand, its cold brass spokes spinning with an unnerving lack of resistance. Rachel gripped it with both hands, her knuckles white, planted her feet on the rough concrete floor, and pulled. The heavy steel door did not swing open easily. It moved with a low, resonant groan, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very core of the mountain, the protest of a giant being disturbed from a 50-year slumber. The bottom edge scraped against the floor, sending a shiver through the soles of her boots. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged it inward, her muscles screaming in protest. A puff of air, cool and utterly sterile, washed over her face, carrying with it the scent of old paper, the faint tang of ozone, and something else, a clean, metallic scent that was entirely alien to the dusty, diesel-haunted outpost. It was not the musty, damp breath of a tomb, but the perfectly preserved atmosphere of a hermetically sealed chamber. The air itself was a relic. For a long moment, she simply stood at the threshold, her own breathing harsh and loud in the sudden quiet. Her headlamp beams sliced into an abyss of perfect blackness, a void that had not known light since the day it was sealed. This was it, the culmination of the suspicious weld, the phantom conduit, the hollow wall, the grueling work in the suffocating crawlspace. Every instinct, every bit of her training had led her to this precise moment. A profound sense of anticipation, so powerful it was almost a physical force, settled over her. She took one deep, steadying breath, the cold, clean air of the vault a shock to her lungs, and stepped inside. The vault was a small, austere cube of a room, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were bare, poured concrete, but the space was dominated by simple, sturdy wooden shelves that lined 3 of the walls from floor to ceiling. On these shelves, stacked with military precision, were dozens of identical wooden crates. They were utilitarian, built for function and not for form, their raw wood aged to a pale silvery gray. Rachel swept her light across the stacks, her beam illuminating the stark black letters stenciled on the side of each one. The words were mundane, almost comically so. U.S. Government, Survey Equipment, Class 4. A flicker of genuine disappointment, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at her. Survey equipment, theodolites, tripods, and measuring tapes? After all this, after breaking through a wall and a vault door that could have survived a near-nuclear miss, the grand secret was a stash of forgotten mapping tools? The thought was so absurd it was almost funny. But the feeling passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, hard logic of her training. Nothing in a place like this is ever what it seems. Deception was a fundamental principle of the world that had built this outpost. The more innocent the label, the more sinister the contents were likely to be. This wasn't a storage locker, it was a deception. A cover story written in block letters and black paint. The very mundanity of the label was the most suspicious thing about it. Why go to such extreme, paranoid lengths to hide survey equipment? The answer was simple: you wouldn't. The crates were a lie. Her disappointment morphed into a renewed, sharper sense of certainty. She was not at the end of the trail, she was standing right on top of the X. She ran her light over the crates again, deciding which one to open. Not the one at eye level, not the one on top. Her training dictated randomness to defeat any potential booby traps designed for the obvious choice. She selected a crate from the middle of a stack on the right-hand wall at shoulder height. It was heavy, and she had to wrestle it off the shelf, its rough wood scraping against her canvas jacket. She lowered it to the floor with a solid thud that echoed in the small, silent room. Kneeling beside it, she took the claw end of her heavy hammer from her tool belt and wedged it under the edge of the lid. She put her weight on the handle. The old nails, seated in the dry wood for half a century, resisted with a high-pitched, metallic screech, a sound of protest against this violent intrusion. One by one, she worked her way around the lid, the screeching nails the only sound in the world. With a final pull, the last nail gave way, and she lifted the heavy wooden lid, setting it carefully on the floor beside the crate. The interior was filled to the brim with a thick, dense bed of excelsior, a straw-like packing material, its woody scent instantly filling the air. It was dry and brittle, crackling as she reached in. Her gloved fingers brushed the material aside, digging deeper until they hit a hard, flat surface. It was a thin sheet of plywood, cut to fit the crate's interior perfectly. A false bottom, of course. She hooked her fingers under its edge and lifted it out. The beam from her headlamp, directed down into the crate, struck the surface beneath the plywood and was thrown back with a sudden, shocking intensity. The light was so brilliant, so pure, that she flinched, her eyes momentarily dazzled by the reflection. It wasn't the cold, white glint of polished steel or the sparkle of glass. It was a deep, warm, impossibly rich yellow light, a color so pure and vibrant it seemed to hum with its own internal energy. As her eyes adjusted, the image resolved itself into a sight that defied all reason. The crate was filled with gold bars. They were not the rough, pitted bullion she had seen in movies. These were perfect, flawless ingots, their edges machined to sharp, precise angles, their surfaces smooth and lustrous. Each bar was individually sealed in a thick, transparent plastic sleeve, the material still clear and supple after 50 years in the dark. Stamped into the surface of each bar, perfectly legible through the protective plastic, was the iconic eagle seal of a United States government mint, along with a weight, a purity mark, and a unique serial number. The sight was breathtaking, a surreal vision of impossible wealth hidden in a dusty box. The sheer, undeniable reality of it was staggering. The gold seemed to absorb the white light from her headlamp and radiate it back as something ancient and powerful, a concentrated store of history and value. A wave of pure, unadulterated awe washed over her, so potent it left her breathless. Her mind, usually so quick and analytical, struggled to process the sensory input. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering over the cool, smooth surface of a plastic-sealed bar for a long moment before she dared to touch it. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested, a solid, dense, and incontrovertible fact in her hand. The weight was the most real thing she had ever felt. One crate could be an anomaly. She had to be sure. A frantic energy seized her. She moved to the next crate on the stack, pulling it down and attacking the lid with the hammer. The screech of nails, the rustle of packing material, the flash of blindingly brilliant reflected light. It was the same. and the next, and the next. Her movements became a blur of focused, desperate activity. Each crate she opened was a confirmation, another layer of impossibility piled onto the last. They were all the same. The room, the small, secret room hidden deep inside the mountain, was filled with gold. She did a quick, rough calculation in her head. There were at least 50 crates. Each one held at least 20 bars. She had no idea what a single bar was worth, but the total value had to be astronomical. It was a fortune beyond her wildest, most fevered imaginings. She finally reached the last crate, tucked away on the bottom shelf in the far corner, partially obscured by the legs of the shelving unit. It felt different when she pulled it out, subtly lighter than the others. She pried it open, her movements more deliberate now, the initial frantic rush replaced by a kind of reverent curiosity. Inside was the same straw-like packing material, the same perfectly fitted false bottom. But when she lifted the plywood, she found only a single layer of gold bars, not the 2 or 3 layers that had filled the other crates. Resting on top of them, nestled in the center of the golden bed, was a slim manila envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed at the edges, but it was perfectly preserved in the cold, dry air of the vault. The flap was sealed with a circle of dark red wax, hard and brittle with age. Impressed in the center of the wax was a seal she did not recognize. It wasn't the familiar eagle of a government department, but something more obscure, an angular, stylized bird of prey clutching a key in its talons. The adrenaline of the gold discovery receded, replaced by the quiet focus of the technician, the analyst. This, she knew, was more important than the gold. The gold was the what, this envelope was the why. She knelt on the cold floor, the open crate before her like an offering. With the edge of her thumbnail, she carefully broke the brittle wax seal. It crumbled into dusty red fragments. She lifted the flap and pulled out the contents. It was a single sheet of paper, thick and of high quality, folded neatly into thirds. Unfolding it, she saw that it had been typed on an old manual typewriter. The letters were slightly uneven, the ink a faded black. Some characters struck harder than others, leaving a deeper impression on the page. She angled her headlamp to illuminate the text. It was a memorandum. The date was typed in the top right corner, October 19th, 1972. It was from a 4-star general, a name she vaguely recognized from a history course at West Point, a key figure in Cold War strategic planning. It was addressed not to a person, but to a committee, identified only by a code name, Project Nightfall. The text was terse, stripped of all unnecessary language, a piece of pure, functional communication. It detailed the establishment of this contingency reserve, confirming the contents as 400 kilograms of fine gold bullion per crate. It stated the purpose with chilling clarity, to be used for the off-the-books, untraceable funding of stay-behind networks and partisan cells in the event of a successful Soviet occupation of North America. It was money to fund a ghost war, a final, desperate resistance from the shadows of a fallen nation. Then she read the final paragraph, the words that changed everything. She read it once, then a second time, letting the full import of the bureaucratic language settle over her. Retrieval to be actioned only upon receipt of signal Echo Delta Zero via secure channel. If no signal is received by January 1, 1990, asset is to be considered abandoned in place. Acknowledge and destroy. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with the final, metallic finality of a deadbolt sliding home. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The apocalyptic future this gold was meant to fund had never come to pass. The signal, the cryptic command of Echo Delta Zero, was never sent. The committee, Project Nightfall, its members were almost certainly long dead. Their knowledge of this place turned to dust with them. The government, in its vast, compartmentalized, and labyrinthine bureaucracy, had simply forgotten it existed. This wasn't stolen money. It wasn't a corrupt general slush fund. It was, by its own explicit definition, abandoned. A ghost of a forgotten war, a relic of a future that never happened. She understood now with a sudden, shocking clarity. This vault was a time capsule, not just of gold, but of a specific kind of fear, the deep existential paranoia of an era when the end of the world was a plausible daily possibility. And she, Rachel Brooks, former staff sergeant, new owner of a concrete ghost, had just opened it. The weight of the discovery, of the history and the responsibility it represented, settled on her shoulders, a burden far heavier than any of the gold bars in the room. Rachel didn't hesitate. Her decision was not a choice, but a reflex, an action dictated by a lifetime of ingrained duty. The gold was a spectacle, a fantasy made real, but the typed memorandum in her hand was the truth. It was the protocol. She carefully folded the brittle paper along its original creases and slid it back into the manila envelope. With a reverence that felt almost religious, she placed the envelope back in the crate, resting it gently on the single layer of gold bars. She did not move a single ingot. She did not pocket a single souvenir. This was not her property, it was a scene, and she was now its custodian. She backed out of the vault, pulling the heavy steel door until it groaned shut, the broken locking mechanism leaving it slightly ajar but closed. She crawled back through the suffocating darkness of the tunnel, emerging into the dusty, diesel-scented air of the generator room, blinking in the relative brightness. The world outside the vault felt different now, charged with the energy of the secret it had held. She took out her phone. The screen's modern, clinical glow was a stark anachronism in the Cold War tomb. Methodically, she began to document everything. She took wide shots of the broken cinderblock wall, close-ups of the crawlspace entrance, and then, squeezing back into the tunnel, she photographed the vault door, the broken lock, the scratched-in cut code. She documented the crates, the stenciled markings, the contents of the one she had opened, and finally, a clear, high-resolution image of the memorandum itself. Each photo was a piece of evidence, a link in a chain of custody she was forging on her own. With the documentation complete, she made her way back through the silent, echoing corridors of the outpost, her footsteps sure and steady. She walked past the mess hall with its ghostly salt shakers, past the barracks with their empty bunks, and into the command center. The room was a museum of dead technology, but she knew from the blueprints that one system had been left operational by law, a single, dedicated emergency landline, a direct link to the outside world. It sat on a steel desk, a heavy, black rotary phone that looked like a prop from an old movie. She lifted the receiver. The dial tone, a clear, steady hum, was the most reassuring sound she had ever heard. There was never a question of keeping it, of spiriting away the gold in the dead of night. Her entire life, from her enlistment day to her honorable discharge, had been about structure, about rules, about doing the right thing even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. This was no different. She was a staff sergeant. She was following protocol, even if it was a protocol she had to invent on the spot. Her finger, steady and sure, began to turn the rotary dial, the rhythmic clicking sound echoing in the vast, silent room as she dialed the number for the state comptroller's office. "Yes," she said, her voice calm and clear, betraying none of the wildness of the last few hours. "My name is Rachel Brooks. I need to report the discovery of abandoned property on a former federal site I recently purchased." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of bureaucratic confusion. "Yes," Rachel repeated patiently. "I'll hold." The arrival of the authorities was swift, but it was also unnervingly quiet. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just a pair of black government sedans crunching softly up the gravel road a few hours later, their dark paint seeming to absorb the afternoon light. A team of 4 serious-looking men and women in dark, conservative suits stepped out, their city shoes ill-suited for the rugged terrain. They were auditors from the state and 2 silent observers from the federal government, their faces polite but firm, their eyes missing nothing. The contrast was stark. These clean, professional people moving through the dusty, forgotten outpost like visitors from another planet. Rachel, calm and composed, escorted them through the main levels, her explanations brief and factual. She led them to the generator room, to the hole in the wall, and pointed them toward the crawlspace. She did not go in with them. She had done her part. Now it was their scene. They worked with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. One of them documented the entrance while 2 others, younger and more agile, disappeared into the tunnel with powerful flashlights and equipment cases. The sounds that came back were muffled, the quiet clicks of cameras, the low murmur of professional jargon. Rachel waited with the lead auditor, a gray-haired man with a tired but intelligent face, who stood by the silent diesel generator, making notes on a small leather-bound pad. After what felt like an eternity, one of the younger auditors emerged from the crawl space, his suit now smudged with 50-year-old dust. He handed a file folder to the lead auditor, who opened it and reviewed the contents, his expression unreadable. He looked up at Rachel, his gaze direct and searching. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Would you accompany us, please?" They crawled one by one into the vault, the small space now crowded with their bodies and the bright, sterile beams of their lights. They had opened every crate. The room was filled with the warm, breathtaking glow of the gold, a sight that was still just as shocking the second time. The auditors were meticulously cataloging every bar, weighing them on a small, portable digital scale, and cross-referencing the serial numbers with a list on a laptop that seemed impossibly advanced in this time capsule of a room. The process was slow, methodical, and utterly silent except for the quiet tapping of keys and the soft clink of metal on metal. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, the lead auditor made a final notation on his laptop and turned to Rachel. "Based on our initial assessment," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "the total weight is approximately 110 kilograms. At current market value, the contents of this vault are worth approximately $6.5 million. The number hung in the air, a figure of such magnitude it seemed to have a physical weight. Rachel simply nodded, her face betraying nothing. The auditor looked at her, a flicker of something like admiration in his tired eyes. "You did the right thing, Ms. Brooks, calling this in. You have no idea the legal and jurisdictional headache you've avoided, and the service you've done." Rachel met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. "I was a staff sergeant in the Army Signal Corps," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We don't abandon our posts, and we don't walk away from our duty." The auditor held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a slight, respectful nod. In the silent golden room, deep in the heart of the mountain, a quiet understanding passed between them, a mutual respect between two very different kinds of public servants. The weeks that followed were a slow, grinding education in the labyrinthine world of property law. Rachel, on the advice of the state comptroller's office, hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in obscure property and salvage claims. Together, they filed a formal claim under the state's abandoned property statutes. It was a long, complex legal process, a battle fought not with weapons but with paper, with precedents and clauses and legal arguments that were as dense and arcane as any military code. The federal government, as expected, initially tried to claim sovereign ownership, arguing that the gold had always been and would always be the property of the United States. Their lawyers were formidable, a team from the Department of Justice who argued that the Outpost, even when sold, was still subject to federal oversight. But the memo Rachel had found, the single typed sheet of paper from 1972, was the key. It was her irrefutable truth. Her lawyer presented the high-resolution photograph in court. The phrase "abandoned in place" became the central pillar of their argument. It was not a suggestion, it was a directive. The memo, written by a four-star general, was an explicit relinquishment of the asset under a specific set of conditions which had been met on January 1, 1990. The state's claim, therefore, and by extension Rachel's finder's claim as the legal owner of the property where the asset was discovered, held up. The legal battle dragged on for months, a slow, agonizing war of attrition. Rachel's life savings dwindled as the legal fees mounted. There were days when she stood at the entrance of the outpost, looking out over the quiet valley, and wondered if she had made a colossal mistake. But then she would remember the quiet certainty she felt in the vault, the absolute conviction that she was doing the right thing. That conviction was her anchor in the storm of legal uncertainty. The decision, when it finally came down, arrived not with a dramatic courtroom pronouncement, but with a quiet phone call from her lawyer. The court had ruled in their favor. The federal claim was denied. The state of Wyoming officially took ownership of the $6.5 million in gold. And, according to the clear and unambiguous letter of the state's abandoned property law, Rachel, as the finder, was entitled to a finder's award. It was a significant percentage of the total value, a sum of money so large it felt abstract, unreal. It was not just about the money. It was about the vindication. Her instincts had been right. Her actions had been correct. She had followed the rules, she had trusted the system, and for once the system had worked. A wave of profound relief washed over her, so powerful it made her knees weak. It was the feeling of a heavy pack being lifted from her shoulders after a long and arduous march. She had won. The final scene takes place a year later, on a bright, crisp autumn day. The gravel road leading up to the outpost is no longer rutted and overgrown, but smooth and well-maintained. The outpost itself is transformed. It is no longer a dusty, decaying relic of a forgotten war. It is the Sentinel Mountain Museum, its name painted in clean, bold letters on a large wooden sign at the entrance. The concrete facade has been cleaned, the broken windows replaced, and the entire facility is clean, well-lit, and open to the public. A yellow school bus is parked in the newly paved lot, and the sound of children's laughter, bright and clear, echoes in the mountain air. Inside, the corridors that were once thick with dust and silence are now filled with light and life. Children, including a proud, 10-year-old Leo acting as a very enthusiastic junior tour guide, explore the barracks and the command center, their faces a mixture of awe and excitement. The welded armory door is still there, but it is now a historical exhibit, protected by a velvet rope. The crawl space in the generator room has been sealed with a thick plate of plexiglass, and a simple, elegant plaque on the wall next to it tells the incredible story of the hidden vault, the forgotten gold, and the woman who found it. The centerpiece of the museum, the heart of the entire facility, is a display dedicated to the history of signals intelligence. It is Rachel's personal project, the one she poured her heart and soul into. On the wall hangs her old unit patch, its colors bright and proud. In a climate-controlled glass case, resting on a bed of black velvet, is a single inert gold bar, a perfect replica of the ones found in the vault. Next to it, also under glass, is a copy of the typed memo from 1972, its chilling words a stark reminder of a past that almost was. A small speaker, hidden in the display, plays a recording on a continuous loop, a faint, crackling radio transmission, an example of the kind of coded communication Rachel used to monitor in the dead of night in a desert halfway around the world. Rachel stands at the main entrance, watching the children as they cluster around the exhibits, their eyes wide with wonder. She is not a soldier anymore, not in the official sense. But she is still a guardian. She has preserved a piece of history, and in doing so, she has built a future for her son, a future of security and opportunity she could once only have dreamed of. The wind, whipping down from the high peaks, snaps a flag on the tall pole outside the entrance. It is not the national flag. It is the orange and white flag of her old Signal Corps unit. The crossed flags and lightning bolt a symbol of her past, flying proudly over the mountain she now calls home. The story ends there, with a group of children gathered around the signal's intelligence display, listening intently as a guide, a young history student from the local university, explains how courage and information can travel through the darkness, carried on a simple, invisible radio wave, a voice in the static, a signal in the noise.